that cool? I love that. Good to see you guys. How are you today? Good. Beautiful day out there, isn't it? I'm moving to Florida. That's it. That settles it. I am moving to Florida. Well, before we kick into the message today, something that for those of you that are owners, which is our membership, next Sunday after this service, we're going to have a brief meeting. We want to give you an update kind of on organizational structure stuff that we started a year ago that you guys gave us permission to do. We want to give you an update on that. So that's next Sunday after this service. And as Jake said, don't forget to set your clocks back. The fun thing is it becomes really obvious who didn't as we go through the service. So that's going to be a blast next week too. Last week, we started a new series called God of the Underdogs, which I love the theme. I love the focus on that. Last week, for those of you that weren't here, one of the things that we learned was the very thing that people see in you that they think would disqualify you from God being able to do something great is the very thing that attracts God to you. It's the very thing that God sees in you that he will use in your life in great ways. And today I want to talk to you about labels. Labels are important. Labels matter because the fact is the labels that you accept determine the way that you live your life, right? The labels that you accept determine the way that you live your life. For instance, I've got several labels that apply to me. You've got some that apply to you. And matter of fact, there's blanks where you can put in your own. But one of my labels is husband. Once I accepted the label of husband, that meant that it was no longer okay to just play basketball and not let somebody know where I was. I had a wife, she was waiting for me, and I now had to say, here's where I am, right? And so my label as husband, it changed the way that I live my life. One of the other labels that I have is dad. And as a dad, once I accepted the label of dad, that meant that now I was going to go to a lot of events and things that I would have absolutely no interest in otherwise. But I'm going because my kids are in it, and that's what dads are supposed to do. Some of you have the label mom, right? And it doesn't take long for you to realize that because as soon as they begin talking, it's mom, 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 mommy, 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 right? It's mom, mom. And there's sometimes when you go, I'm kind of tired of the label right now. And then Mother's Day comes and you're like, Mom, it's such a wonderful label. Look at this. But your label really determines the way that you live your life. Now, one of the labels that I have mixed feelings about is the label pastor. Because I'll be having a conversation with somebody, getting to know them, everything will be perfectly normal and perfectly fine, and then they ask the dreaded question, what do you do for a living? And I wish I had written a book. Someday I'm going to write a book so I can just say I'm an author, right? And as soon as I say I'm a pastor, like, nice weather we're having today, isn't it? And as a matter of fact, one time when I was working in the insurance company, when I was in that time when I was going to seminary full-time and working part-time in the insurance company, I was in a body shop here in town, and there was a lot of extra damage on a car that they had found, and so we needed to go in there and write a second estimate. We called that a supplement to be able to pay for the additional damage that they found. And when I went there, I was getting set up, and the assistant manager says, well, what's new in your life? And I'm like, well, I'm part-time now, and I'm going to seminary, and so it's been a big shift in my life. And he's like, oh, okay. And then I went out to go talk with the body shop technician to find out, okay, what's the stuff that's needed on the car that we missed the first time? And if you were watching this on TV, on video, the conversation would have looked like this. Well, I need that beep molding over there, and I need that beep part over there, and this part over here. You didn't give me enough beep time for me to go ahead and fix that either. So, and I didn't think anything of it. It was just a part of the business. And as he's talking to me, the body shop assistant manager walks by, and he goes, what are you doing? And both of us kind of look back, and we jump back. And he goes, this guy's studying to be a preacher, and you're like cussing like a sailor, man. What are you doing? And he's like flipping out, and I'm like, hey, I said, time out. man, I would rather have somebody be themselves around me than somebody pretend to be something that they're not because they think I'm going, in ministry or whatever like that. And are you guys the same way? Wouldn't you just rather people be authentic and be who they are than to try to act a different way around you? Well, that's the way I am. And so this pastor thing, it's kind of, it's kind of a mixed thing. Our biker group, Psychotherapy is the name of our biker group. That's true. They know that when we're out riding and when we're meeting people, don't call me pastor. Because I don't want people to act differently because of a label that I have on me. Now, you guys have labels too. And some of the labels we have are labels that came early on. Some of them, when kids are little, they're all physical. It's like, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too tall, you're too short. We get those things pretty early on. Sometimes a label is a mistake that we made, and somebody just continues to remind us of it. And labels like, liar, cheat, thief, felon, any of those kind of labels. Some labels are shame-based to kind of go to the core of who you are, like you're a bum, you're a loser, you'll never amount to anything. And those labels, man, they're powerful. And we don't often think about it, but those labels are so powerful because they determine the way that we live our lives. Those things mark us. And today, what I want to talk with you about is what do we do about that? What do you do? How do the labels, how do you get past the labels? How can you begin to live life with a whole new sense of who you are? And the irony about all of this is this. We've all been on the receiving end of bad labels. We've all been labeled. We've all had to deal with that stuff, but yet we seem so willing to give them out too, don't we? And we look at people according to their failures, and we talk about people according to their failures, and when we do that, we're doing the same thing. How do we get free from all of this? Well, today I think God wants to do something really powerful in all of us through this. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the life of a young man named Jacob. And we're going to go back to the very beginning of his life. But before we jump into the passage, here's what you need to know. His mother, Rebecca, in a time when she was just praying, God revealed to her, hey, you've got twins. And this is going to be unusual because the older one, he's going to serve the younger one. Now, that was unusual because in that culture, the older one, the firstborn, was the one that got 2/3 of the inheritance. They were the ones that got, the big blessing. They became the patriarch of the clan when dad passed on. And everybody else kind of came underneath the older one. But God revealed to her, hey, the older one's actually going to serve the younger one. And this was really important because there was a big sense of destiny that God had upon this family. And what it meant was that it looks like the younger one is going to be the one that is going to be the primary instrument for blessing and destiny that God has his hand on. So let's jump right into Genesis chapter 25, introduce you to the family. It says, and when the time came to give birth, Rebecca, that's the mom, discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one, check out this description. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat. Wow. So they named him Esau. I guess Sasquatch was not a name that they used back then. Could have been Sasquatch, except they weren't describing his hair. They were describing his color. Esau means red. So they're like, he's red and he's hairy. When he grows up, I can tell you, he walks right out of Duck Dynasty. Just think Duck Dynasty. Camo, hunter, outdoorsman. Man, that's him. It says, then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob, which means deceiver, trickster, like imposter. They gave him that name. And Isaac was 60 years old. The dad was 60 years old when the twins were born. Here's the first thing I want you to see. From the time he was born, Jacob had been labeled. Now, there's a predisposition because mom already knows that the older is going to serve the younger. So here's what happens. When he comes out, he's just a baby. He's not thinking, right? He's grabbing onto his brother's heel, but they interpret that. because they already have a sense of where this is going. So they go, I know why you're grabbing his heel, because you're a trickster, that's why. Because you're like pulling him. You're like, I'm taking your place. You're coming down here. I'm going to be up there. And so they gave him the name Deceiver. That's his label that he's born with. And so many labels begin when we are very young. The very first labels that we learn about ourselves, where do we get them from? Our parents. Later on, we get them from our peers, but initially, we get them from our parents. And when a child is born, they're wondering, who am I? And we look to our parents to help us to know who we are. Now, for some of you, that's a bummer because the labels that you got from your parents weren't good from the very beginning. And the things that were kind of plastered on your soul, the things that you learned about you might not have been good things to learn. But you know what? You don't have to say negative things to a child for a child to get the wrong message. Did you know that? The fact is all you have to do is not say anything positive. All you have to do is be quiet. All you have to do is withdraw. And believe it or not, when you withdraw, a child has a sense that there's a blank that's supposed to be filled by you. You're supposed to tell me who I am. And when you leave that blank, a child processes that very unusually. I have a friend that played at one time in his first concert, played his instrument. He had a part in that where it was like a solo, and his parents came. This was his first time ever to play publicly like that. And man, he was like nervous. You can imagine what it was like. And he plays his instrument, and then his family, they got in a car and they're driving home, and his heart is like wanting to hear, what do you think he wants to hear from his dad? I'm proud of you. Good job, right? It was dead silent. And he didn't interpret that as, well, Dad has a hard time expressing his feelings. You know how he interpreted that? What's the matter with me? That my dad wouldn't tell me he's proud of me. And what kids do is when we withhold from them, they fill in the blank with something called shame. That becomes their label. There's something wrong with me. And so many of the messages that we get from early on are based in this thing called shame, like there's something that's the matter with me. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever taken a look at the labels that you got? But here's the other thing. Have you ever listened to the labels that you give out? Are they the same ones that you got? Are you just repeating things that you grew up under? Or are you able to see somebody according to their potential and give them a label that nobody else is giving them? Are you able to see past their mistakes and their failures and able to speak life to them instead of defining them by their failure or by their problem? You know, we have the power to make a big difference, don't we? And one of my prayers is, God, give me eyes to always look at the potential in people and not define them by the mistakes that they make. Help me, God, to see them the way that you do. From the time he was born, Jacob had been labeled. And it gets kind of complicated because Jacob, what happens is one day he's cooking and he's making this great stew. And here comes his brother from his hunting expedition, got the full camo on, comes in, and he's like, man, I am so hungry. I want you to give me some of that stew. Now, Jacob had studied his brother, and here's what he knew. My brother, he lives according to his appetites, and he just lives for immediate gratification. He doesn't think long term. This is my chance. And his brother says, hey, come on, give me some of that stew. And he goes, no problem. You want a bowl of stew? Here's what it'll cost you. You give me your birthright, which is like saying, when the will from Dad is being written, we're crossing your name out as the firstborn, and we're putting my name in. And his brother Esau looks at him and goes, well, what good is a birthright if I'm starving to death? Deal. And he shakes on it. And then, probably what's going on in the back of his mind is this. I can shake on that because I know what's going to happen. There's going to come a day when Dad is going to pass on me the blessing of the firstborn. He doesn't know about our little conversation here, and so privately, he's going to take me aside. He's going to put his hand on me. He's going to bestow God's blessing for our future on me. And even though I ate this bowl of porridge, it's still going to come to me. And sure enough, years later, after his father, Isaac, had grown blind and he's beginning to lose some sensitivity, his father said, hey, Esau, why don't you go out and get some game and cook it the way I like it. And when you come back, son, I'm gonna lay my hands on you and you're going to get the blessing, the firstborn. Esau's like, sounds good. So he goes out the door. The problem was that Rebekah, the mom, overheard the conversation. So she goes to Jacob, and she goes, hey, you're up to bat now. Here we go. Here's the deal. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cook this meal, and you're going to go in there, and you're going to tell your father that you are Esau so that you get the blessing. And there's Jacob. He's like, Mom, I'm not hairy like my brother is. I'm nothing like my brother. How's this going to work? She goes, don't worry about it. What we're going to do is we're going to cover your arm with an animal skin so that if he feels you, he'll think it's Esau. And we're going to have you wear his clothing so that when he smells you, it's going to smell like the outdoors. You're going to have Esau's clothes on. So sure enough, he goes in there. And Mom cooks the meal. And Jacob walks in and he goes, hey, Dad, it's time to eat. Ready for you to give me the blessing. Now, the dad, he's pretty sharp. He understands Jacob. Says, Dad's a little suspicious. He goes, how did you get that so quickly? And Jacob, in true Jacob fashion, goes, God gave me success, Dad. That's how I got it. His dad goes, your voice sounds a lot like Jacob's to me. Why don't you come here a little bit? And he touches his arm and he feels the hairiness of it. And he goes, okay, the voice sounds like Jacob, but the arm feels like Esau. And so he pulls him close and he gives him the sniff test. He hugs him and just, Duck Dynasty. Yep, must be Esau. That's what he said. And he lays his hands on him and he blesses him. You could only bless once. You could never take it back. And he pronounces a blessing of God over him that was to determine the destiny of their clan and a destiny of a nation. And as soon as it's done, Jacob goes, thanks, Dad, and he gets out of there. Right about then, Esau, who had been out hunting, has game, has cooked it, and walks in the room right after his brother had just turned the corner. And he's like, okay, Dad, I've got the meal. Now you can bless me. And his dad goes, who are you? He goes, I'm Esau. And the dad, Isaac, he starts shaking. He starts just coming undone. And take a look at what he says. He says, Isaac said this, your brother was here and he tricked me. He's taken away your blessing. And Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob, deceiver. For now he has cheated me twice. First, he took my rights as the firstborn, and now he has stolen my blessing. Here's the second thing that I want you to see. Jacob only reinforced the label with his own behavior. It's hard when you have a label. What makes it worse is when we do things that actually reinforce it or we interpret as reinforcing it. It's hard to shake a label when somebody's told you that you're stupid, and then you try your hardest in school, and when you don't get a good grade, you go, I'm stupid. It's hard to shake a label when somebody's told you you'll never amount to anything, and you try out for something, and you don't make the team, and you go, oh, I'm never going to amount to anything. It's hard when we begin to reinforce labels with our own behavior. It's hard to shake it. It's hard to get past that when that happens. Now, when I was a kid, a lot of you know that it was just strange for me growing up as this, half Japanese kid in a rural part of Wisconsin. And I was not a good swimmer, but one of the things that I did well and then I kind of looked forward to is when we had a unit on diving. I could dive well. Diving wasn't a problem. The whole swimming and the rhythmic breathing and snarfing in water and, kind of going under, that was my fear. But when you dove, I was so skinny, man, I just cruised like a torpedo through the water. I could get to the edge of the pool on the opposite side, no problem. And for me, that was like the one thing I was looking forward to because I was so scared of water. I was so terrified of water. But that was a time when I could put all that aside and the whole, half Japanese thing and all that stuff. People could look at me that I could do something good and do it just for who I was. And that unit came, and Mr. Soiki would stand there with his clipboard, and we would dive, and he would score us and grade us. And I went ahead, and I did my dive, and it went great. And I came up out of the water, and Mr. Soiki, he said, "You did good." And I'm thinking for a moment, great. They're not looking at me as the Asian kid. They're not looking at me as the kid who can't swim. And right after he said, "You did good," he goes, "You remind me of a Japanese pearl diver." Ah! Couldn't shake it even then, even when I did well. Have you ever had a label that you just couldn't shake? Have you ever been in a gathering and there was a failure that you had a long time ago, and it's finally time when everybody has forgotten about it, and suddenly somebody tells the story, and you're like, oh, just when you thought it was gone, it comes back again. It's so frustrating. It's so hard when that label continues to follow us. It's so hard because sometimes we end up reinforcing it. And after Esau realized what Jacob had done to him, his conclusion was simple. Gonna kill him. That's it. Killing him. Gonna kill him. He's done. And of course, Mom overhears that and tells Jacob, and he takes off. And he takes off for a long time. He goes far away. He ends up getting married. He ends up having kids. He ends up his whole business begins to expand, herds, livestock. God is blessing him. All this stuff is happening. And then one day God says, "Now you're going back home." And he's terrified because he knows that he's done his brother wrong. And so Jacob begins to make his way back. And what he does is he sends servants ahead of him, and he sends livestock ahead of him, and he says, "You go to Esau, and you tell him that I've got a family now, and God's blessing me, and I want him to receive me well. I want him to receive me that way." And so he sends his servants on ahead. And he's so scared that he literally takes his family, and he splits them in two, puts them in two different camps, and he figures, well, if he's mad, if he kills somebody, at least he'll only kill half my family. And he gets his family across the river on ahead of him, and then he goes back and he gets all of his belongings, and he gets all his belongings across the river. All of his servants and everybody is across the river, and he stays behind, and he's all by himself at camp. And he's in that place where he's coming face to face with the fear of the way that he's lived his life because of the label that he's been wearing and the way he's been living out that label. And there, when he's alone in camp, that's where God meets him, right there. And God comes kind of manifesting as a man, angel, hard to tell. But in this figure that he's with, Jacob is like, "Come on, let's wrestle. Let's wrestle." And it's at nighttime, and look what it says in Genesis 32. It says, "A man came and wrestled with him until dawn began to break." So they're at it. It's almost morning. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of his socket. Wow. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." And Jacob, with his hip out of socket, now having to put his arms to support himself around this man, now dependent upon him to hold him up, says, "I won't let you go until you bless me." And then probably the worst question that God could have asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob." "Deceiver." "That's my name." And he could no longer do anything except be completely dependent upon God at that moment. And God looks at him after he admits who he is, and he says, "Your name, your label,
will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you'll be called Israel, which is where the nation gets its name. Because you've fought with God and with men, and you've won. You're an overcomer. Please tell me your name, Jacob said. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there, and he was gone. There's an amazing thing that as he's there, he's just completely dependent on God. But in order for God to do something, in order for God to bless him, God did it by beginning on the level of giving him a new label. He wasn't asking Jacob to be impressive and change your ways all on your own strength, and when you can get your act together, then I will finally bless you. He simply needed Jacob to be honest about who he was. So, who are you? What's your name? I'm the liar, God. I'm the deceiver. That's my name. And because he was willing to admit who he was, God blessed him. Have you ever had that place in your life where you've wrestled with God about the things that you have done and the fear about what was coming and the uncertainty about all that? Have you ever gotten to a place where you've become dead level honest about who you are? Forget about what anybody thinks you are. Forget about the appearance that you give and the impression that you make. Regardless of how great you look like you've got things together like Jacob did. Or you could become honest with God and just say, God, I'm a sinner. I look at my life and I know what's going on. And I need you. Can I tell you that that's exactly the place where God can start? And that's a good turning point. I've got a good friend who, they came here, they've moved away, and he came here for years. And he'd hear these messages for years. His wife became a believer here. And things were not going well in their house, but he was always here. And I thought everything was just cool. Everything was okay. The guy was always here. He always seemed to be smiling, always sitting in the back and just kind of, yep, everything's okay. But things were not okay in their lives. And he kind of kept carrying on and carrying on and carrying on. And one day, he finally came to grips with the patterns that were going on in his life and the things that were happening. His wife had said, I've had enough. That's it, I've had enough. And it forced him to take a look in a mirror. And finally, he looked and said, I'm an alcoholic. That changed everything for them. It was at that point when he began to get help that he told me I began to understand the grace of God. I never really got it before because he wasn't being honest about who he was. And once he did, God began such a radical work of transformation in my friend's life that I actually had to sit down with his wife and coach her because she didn't know what to do with the new man that was now in the household. Have you ever been that honest with God? You know, that's what baptism does. You know, God is about changing the label, and what baptism is God is taking people from different nations, different backgrounds, different traditions, different values, all sorts of labels, all sorts of backgrounds. And what baptism is the washing away of every other label. God's saying, baptize them in the name of the Father, one name, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's the only label that's on you from that point forward. You're mine. That's what baptism does. And it's the great equalizer. And you would think that this moment where he knows that God is saying, hey, you're not going to be called Jacob anymore. You're going to be Israel. You're an overcomer now. You would think that that would be enough to change him. But it wasn't. And it wasn't for the same reason that it's often not for people to go to church. You see, people can come here all the time and hear about God's forgiveness, God's love. And yet, some of you probably going, how come I'm not like feeling it, getting it? How come there's no real change here? See, there was something going on in Jacob's life that isn't immediately clear. And here's what was going on. He was an idolater. He believed in a lot of different gods. And so when God said to him, or when he asked God, what's your name? God said, why do you need to know? because you're not ready to know my name. All God wanted him to know at that point is, I've got a different destiny for you. And here's the truth. At that point, God had made up his mind about Jacob, but Jacob had not yet made up his mind about God. And so God appears to him and says, hey, I want you to come down to Bethel. And before he does that, take a look at what Jacob does. It says, Jacob told everyone in his household, get rid of all your pagan idols. It's his household. Get rid of all of our pagan idols. Purify yourselves and put on clean clothing. We are now going to Bethel. And look what he says, where I will build an altar to the God who answered my prayers when I was in distress. He has been with me wherever I have gone. Now, you would think that after the first time of meeting God that way, that things would have changed, but it didn't. Because what happened was, after the first time, Jacob met with Esau. Esau welcomed him and said, man, it's good to see you. Glad you're back. Why don't you come with me, come with us, and come back to the town, and we'll be able to live there together. Now Jacob, he goes, hey, my family, we move kind of slow. There's a lot of us. We got little kids and stuff. So you go on ahead of us, and then we'll catch up, and we'll all live there together. That'll be great. So Esau goes ahead, and he goes on, and he's out there, and Jacob goes an entirely different direction to live in an entirely different place. He continued to lie even after God told him that you're no longer Jacob, you're Israel. And the reason he continued in the same pattern is even though God had made up his mind about him, he had not made up his mind about God until now. When he tells his family, get rid of all the idols. I want one voice, one God. No more confusion, no more wandering, no more looking for direction from all these different voices, all these different sources. I want the one God that I know loves me, answers my prayers. I want one voice. I don't want the confusion anymore. I don't want to live in the fear anymore. I don't want to wonder about who I am anymore. I want one voice. We're making this decision today. And they buried all of those idols. They buried them. And then they went up to Bethel. It says God appeared to him again at Bethel. God blessed him, saying, again, your name is Jacob. You will not be called Jacob any longer. From now on, your name will be Israel. So God renamed him Israel. Same thing he said before. Here's what changes. Then God said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. You will become a great nation, even many nations. Kings will be among your descendants. And he speaks destiny over him. He speaks future. He speaks potential. God absolutely bestows all of that upon him. What was the difference between the first blessing and the second blessing? In the first blessing, God had made up his mind about Jacob. But Jacob still was listening to all the other inputs. And until he said, I want one, and that's God's, he wasn't ready to know God's name until then. He wasn't ready to know the power of God until he was ready to make up his mind about who he was going to listen to. Here's the fourth thing. The new label sticks only after Jacob chooses to believe God above all else. When you live your life and you have empowered people to speak a label over you, and you've tried so hard to prove them wrong, and you've tried so hard to break that and to shake it, and in your own power to clean up your act and to try to prove that you're not that person that people say that you are, when you've spent so much time and energy doing that, you've been trying from the outside in. What God is trying to do is to change you from the inside out. And the only way that happens is when God changes your label. He gives you the new name. And when you have let those other voices to become so empowered that they speak over you, it's like you have a lot of little gods that are telling you who you are, how to define yourself. You're looking to other people for their opinions, their validation, little gods. And some of you have not experienced a major change. Even though you come to church, you're like, how come I seem to not get it? It's because you need to bury your idols. Because you got to make a decision. God has made up his mind about you. But have you made up your mind about him? Have you come to the point where you say, above all else, no more confusion, no more searching and looking at people to try to get a sense of validation, a sense of who I am? I want one voice, and I want to get it clear. I want to get it clearly. I want it tattooed on my heart, my mind, and all that I am. Have you ever come to that point where you've done that? Hey, maybe you hear about Jesus, and Jesus, he died on a cross for you. He forgives you of your sin. You know that, but at the same time, you're like, why is it that nothing's really changing in me? Well, years ago, this is just an illustration, but if you can imagine that a long time ago, there being a kingdom. And in the kingdom where the king was, there were prostitutes. It was just a part of life there. And the king one day says, I know how I can change them. I'm going to pronounce forgiveness over all them. Amnesty for all prostitutes. We're not going to hold it against you anymore. We're not going to haul you off to jail. And when they find out that they're forgiven, then they're going to say, oh, I feel so much better. And they're going to move on and choose a different lifestyle. And you'd think that would be enough. But is it? No. Because they go, I still got to make ends meet. I still got to live life. I still got to do all this stuff. It's a nice gesture, but I got to live. It's a whole different thing than when a king says, by the way, amnesty for all prostitutes, fully forgiven. And he looks at you and he goes, and I want you to be my bride. I want you to be my queen. Is that enough positive motivation for her to leave the life behind that she had lived? Oh, yeah. Would she realize that she is loved, desired, wanted? That the king wants her to be with him and he wants to walk with her in relationship? How could you turn that down? And see, for many believers or church goers, you have a part of a gospel. You've got God has forgiven you, but the part that you've left out, the part of the story that you've missed, is that he wants you. There's a relationship that he longs for with you. There is you that he desires above all else. And he didn't just die for everybody. He died for your sins because he loves you. And he's looking for you. And see, that's when you realize, oh my goodness, no more other voices, just yours. Because that's who I want, is you, God. Then everything changes at that point. And some, you could stay stuck and say, oh God, but I'm such a sinner. God, how could you ever take me like that? That's what he delights in. The very thing, the very label that you think would disqualify you from his love is the very thing that draws him to you. Because he says, let me take that away. And here's your new one. Bride, son of God, daughter of the king. That's your new label. And for Jacob, that's when it began to change. Listen, are you willing to wrestle with God? Are you willing to wrestle with him and change some labels in your life that you have empowered over yourself? Are you ready to be honest about the person that you've been and let God meet you right there where you could say, God, sinned. I know it. And this person that I've been, God, I need you to change this label. When he looked at Jacob, and after he told him, you've got a new label, he said, by the way, you want to know whose opinion matters? You want to know who I am, Jacob? You want to know the person that's relabeling you? You want to know the one that's before you that has the power to answer your prayers and to lay out your destiny, my name is Almighty God. And no label overcomes my label. No label that anyone else could ever put on you can ever take over the label that I put on you. You're a son now. You're a daughter. You're a bride. And all those little voices that you've empowered, all those opinions, all those failures that you look back on, God says, forget that. That was a part of the old you. But now you're mine. That changes everything, doesn't it? Maybe you're at the place in your life where you go, you know, I've wanted to become a Christian, but I've always felt that God couldn't forgive me, that I just feel so unworthy to be loved like that. See, that's why we praise him so much, because he's so great. And he loves us, even while we've been blowing it. And if you are willing to come to him, I guarantee you this morning, he will meet you right where you are, just like he met Jacob, and he will change your identity. But you have to let him. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes if you would. And for those of you that have never taken that big step of faith with him, maybe you felt unworthy because the labels and the mistakes and the failures have just been so hard to shake. That you didn't know that God could do it for you, because you can't do it for yourself any more than Jacob could. Right where you are, you could tell him, God, I'm a sinner. I keep doing what I hate doing. And I'm so tired of living this way, of not knowing what's in the future and the fear of what's going to happen because of what's going on in my life. So God, forgive me. Come into my life. Jesus, I need your power to live the way you want me to, but I need you to change me from the inside out. I can't do this. And if that's you, you can tell God, God, that's me. That's me. And I want you, God, that's me. And he'll meet you right there. For others of you, it is time to bury the idols that you've empowered to speak over you. It is time for you to stand and become the person that you were created to be. It is time for you to choose one voice, not a bunch of them, one, and believe that one voice above all else. Father, thank you for your grace. God, thank you so much that as you see us, you see a room full of Jacobs, you see a room full of labels, Lord. And yet you are so determined and so passionate about setting us free from those things and freeing us to live life as fully forgiven, dearly loved sons and daughters of yours. So God, we just give you thanks for all these things. Continue to pour out your Spirit, God. Do your deep, deep work. And God, thank you. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.